Chapter 28 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 28. The Way. Keith was still looking for the way when October came, bringing crisp days and chilly winds. When not too cold, the boys still sat out of doors. When it was too cold, John McGuire did not appear at all on his back porch, and Keith did not have the courage to make a bold advance to the McGuires' door and ask admittance. There came a day, however, when a cold east wind came up after they were well established in their porch chairs for the morning. They were on the Burtons' porch this time, and Keith suddenly determined to take the bull by the horns.
"Brr, but it's cold this morning," he shivered blithely. "What say you? Let's go in. Come on."
And without waiting for an acquiescence, he caught John McGuire's arm in his own and half pulled him to his feet. Before John McGuire knew then quite what was happening, he found himself in the house.
No, that is, I think I'd better be going home," he stammered.
But Keith Burton did not seem even to hear.
"Say, just try your hand at this puzzle," he was saying gaily. "I gave it up, and I'll bet you'll have to," he finished, thrusting the pasteboard box into his visitor's hand.
Adjusting the distance, a small table must be pushed in order to bring it conveniently in front of John McGuire's chair. The quick tightening of John McGuire's lips and the proud lifting of his chin told that Keith's challenge had been accepted, even before the laconic answer came.
"Oh, you do you? Well, we'll see whether I'll have to give up or not."
John McGuire loved picture puzzles, as Keith Burton well knew. It was easy after that. Keith took it so unhesitatingly for granted that they were to go indoors when it was cold that John McGuire found it difficult to object. And it was not long before the two boys were going back and forth between the two houses with almost as much ease as if their feet had been guided by the eye instead of by the tap of a slender stick. John McGuire was learning a great deal from Keith these days, though it is doubtful if he realized it. It is doubtful also if he realized how constantly he was being made to talk of the war and of his experience in it. But Keith realized it. Keith was not looking for the way now. He believed he had found it, and there came a day when he deemed the time had come to try to carry it out. They were in his own home living room. It had been a wonderful story that John McGuire had told that day, of a daring excursion into no man's land, and what came of it. Upstairs in the studio Daniel Burton was sitting alone, as Keith knew. Keith drew a long breath and made the plunge. Springing to his feet, he turned towards the door that led to the hall.
"McGuire, that was a bully story, a corking good story. I want Dad to hear it. Wait, I'll get him."
And he was out of the room with the door fast closed behind him before John McGuire could so much as draw a breath. Upstairs Daniel Burton, already in the secret, heard Keith's eager summons and came at once. For some days he had been expecting just such an urgent call from Keith's lips. He knew too much to delay. He was down the stairs and at Keith's side in an incredible short time. Then together they pushed open the door and entered the living room. John McGuire was on his feet. Very plainly he was intending to go home, and at once. But Daniel Burton paid no attention to that. He came straight toward him and took his hand. "I call this mighty good of you, McGuire," he said. "My boy here has been raving about your stories of the war until I'm fairly green with envy. Now I'm to hear a bit of them myself," he says. "I wish you would tell me some of your experiences, my lad. You know a chance like this is a real godsend to us poor stay-at-homes. Now fire away. I'm ready." But John McGuire was not ready. True, he sat down, but not until after a confused, No, I must go home. That is, really, they're not worth repeating, those stories." And he would not talk at all at first. Daniel Burton talked, however. He talked of wars in general, and of the Civil War in particular. And he told stories of Antietam and Gettysburg as they had been told to him by his father. Then from Gettysburg he jumped to Flanders and talked of aeroplanes and gas masks and tanks and trenches and dugouts. Little by little then John McGuire began to talk, sometimes a whole sentence, sometimes only a word or two. But there was no fire, no enthusiasm, no impetuous rush of words that brought the very din of battle to their ears. and not once did Daniel Burton thrust his fingers into his pocket for his pencil and notebook. Yet when it was all over and John McGuire had gone home, Keith dropped into his chair with a happy sigh. "It wasn't much, Dad, I know," he admitted, "but it was something. It was a beginning, and a beginning is something with John McGuire." And it was something, for the next time Daniel Burton entered the room, John McGuire did not even start from his chair. He gave a faint smile of welcome, too, and he talked sooner and talked more, though there was little talk of war, and for the second time Daniel Burton did not reach for his pencil. But the third time he did. A question, a comment, a chance word. Neither Keith nor his father could have told afterward what started it. They knew only that a sudden light as of a flame leapt into John McGuire's face, and he was back in the trenches of France and carrying them with him. At the second sentence Daniel Burton's fingers were in his pockets, and at the third his pencil was racing over the paper at breakneck speed. There was no pause then, no time for thought, no time for careful forming of words and letters. There was only the breakneck race between a bit of lead and an impassioned tongue. And when it was all over, there were only a well-nigh hopeless-looking mass of hieroglyphics in Daniel Burton's notebook, and the sweat of spent excitement on the brows of two youths and a man. "Gee, we got it that time," breathed Keith, after John McGuire had gone home. "Yes, only I was wondering if I had really got it," murmured Daniel Burton, eyeing a bit of ruefully the confused mass of words and letters in his notebook. "Still, I reckon I can dig it out all right, if I do it right away," he finished confidently. And he did dig it out before he slept that night. If Daniel Burton and his son Keith thought the thing was done and it was going to be easy sailing thereafter, they found themselves greatly mistaken. John McGuire scarcely said 5 sentences about the war the next time they were together, though Daniel Burton had his pencil poised expectantly from the start. He said only a little more the next time and the next, and Daniel Burton pocketed his pencil in despair. Then came a day when a chance word about a new air raid, reported in the morning paper, acted like a match to gunpowder and sent John McGuire off into rapid-fire story that whipped Daniel Burton's pencil from his pocket and set it to racing again at breakneck speed to keep up with them. It was easier after that. Still, every day it was like a game of hide-and-seek, with Daniel Burton and his pencil ever in pursuit, and with now and then a casual comment or a tactful question to lure the hiding story out into the open. Little by little, as the frank comradeship of Daniel Burton won its way, John McGuire was led to talk more and more freely, and by Christmas the eager scribe was in possession of a very complete record of John McGuire's war experiences, dated even from the early days of his enlistment. Day by day, as he had taken down the rough notes, Daniel Burton had followed it up with a careful untangling and copying before he had a chance to forget, or to lose the wonderful glow born of the impassioned telling. Then, from time to time, he had sorted the notes and arranged them in proper sequence, until now he had a complete story, logical and well-rounded. It was on Christmas Day that he read the manuscript to Keith. At its conclusion, Keith drew a long, tremulous breath. "Dad, it's wonderful!" he exclaimed. "How did you do it?" You heard yourself." "Yes, but to copy it like that! Why, I could hear him tell it as you read it, Dad. I could hear him." "Could you really? I'm glad. That makes me know I've succeeded. Now for a publisher." "You wouldn't publish it without his knowing." "Certainly not. But I'm going to let a publisher see it before he knows." "Yes, perhaps." "Why, Keith, I'd have to do that. Do you suppose I'd run the risk of its being turned down, and then have to tell the boy that he couldn't have the book after all?" No, I suppose not. But it isn't going to be turned down, Dad. Such a wonderful thing can't be turned down." Perhaps not." Daniel Burton's lips came together a bit grimly. "But there are wonderful things that won't sell, you know. However," he finished with a brisk cheerfulness, "this isn't one of my pictures, nor a bit of Susan's free verse. So there's some hope, I guess, anyhow. We'll see. But we won't tell John until we do see." "All right. I suppose that would be best," sighed Keith, still a little doubtfully. They had not long to wait, after all. In a remarkably short time came back a word from the publishers. Most emphatically they wanted the book, and they wanted it right away. Moreover, the royalty that was offered was so good that it sent Daniel Burton down the stairs 2 steps at a time like a boy, in his eagerness to reach Keith with the good news. "And now for John," he cried excitedly, as soon as Keith's joyous exclamations over the news were uttered. "Come, let's go across now." "But, Dad, how are you going to tell him?" Keith was holding back a little. "Tell him? I'm just going to tell him," laughed the man. "That's easy." "I know, but Keith wet his lips and started again. "You see, Dad, he didn't know we were taking notes of his stories. He couldn't see us. We took advantage of But Daniel Burton would not even listen. "Shucks and nonsense, Keith!" he cried. Then a little grimly he added, "I only wish somebody'd take advantage like that of me, and sell a picture or two when I'm not looking. Come, we're keeping John waiting." And he took a firm hold of his son's arm. Yet in the McGuire living room, in the presence of John McGuire himself, he talked fully 5 minutes of nothing in particular before he said, "Well, John, I've got some good news for you." "Good news?" "That's what I'd call it. I hear you're going to have a book out in the spring." "I'm going to what?" "Have a book out. War stories. They were too good to keep to ourselves, John, so I jotted them down as you told them, and last week sent them off to a publisher." A real publisher?" The boy's voice shook. Every trace of color had drained from his face. "You bet your life! And one of the biggest in the country." Daniel Burton's own voice was shaking. He had turned his eyes away from John McGuire's face. "And they'll print it?" "Just as soon as ever you'll sign the contract. And by the way, that contract happens to be a mighty good one for a first book, my boy." John McGuire drew a long breath. The color was slowly coming back to his face. "But I can't seem to quite believe it," he faltered. "Nonsense! Simplest thing in the world," insisted Daniel Burton briskly. "They saw the stories, liked them, and are going to publish them. That's all." "All? All?" The blind boy was on his feet, his face working with emotion. "When all my life I've dreamed and dreamed and longed for—" He stopped short and sat down. He had the embarrassed air the habitually reserved person usually displays when caught red-handed making a scene. He gave a confused laugh. "I was only thinking what a way. You see, I'd always wanted to be a writer, but I'd given it up long ago. I had my living to earn, and I knew I couldn't earn it that way, not at first. I used to say I'd give anything if I could write a book, and I was just wondering if I'd been willing then to have given my eyes." End of chapter 28. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 29 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 29. Dorothy Tries Her Hand. It was on a mild day in February that Susan met Dorothy Parkman on the street. She stopped her at once. "Well, if I ain't glad to see you!" she cried. "I didn't know you'd got back." "I haven't been back long, Susan." "You ain't been over to see us once, Miss Dorothy," Susan reproached her. I have been very busy." Miss Dorothy seemed ill at ease and anxious to get away. "And you didn't come for a long, long time when you was here last fall." Susan had laid a detaining hand on the girl's arm now. "Didn't I?" Miss Dorothy smiled brightly. "Well, perhaps I didn't. But you didn't need me, anyway. I've heard all about it, the splendid work Mr. Burton and his son have done for John McGuire, and I'm so glad." "Oh, yes, that's all right." Susan spoke without enthusiasm. "And the book is going to be published?" "Yes. Oh, yes." Susan still spoke with a preoccupied frown. "Why, Susan, what's the matter? I thought you'd be glad." Susan drew a long sigh. "I am glad, Miss Dorothy. I'm awful glad for John McGuire. They say it's wonderful, the change in him already. He's so proud and happy to think he's done it. Not sinfully proud, you understand, but just humbly proud and glad. An' his mama says he's writin' other things now, poems an' stories, an' he's as happy as a lark all day. An' I'm awful glad. But it's Keith hisself that I'm thinkin' of. You see, only yesterday I found him cryin'." "Crying!" Miss Dorothy seemed to have forgotten all about her haste to get away. She had Susan's arm in her grasp now. She had pulled her to one side, too, where they could have a little sheltered space to talk, in the angle of two store windows. "Yes, cryin'. You see, 'twas like this," hurried on Susan. "Mis' McGuire was over, an' I'd been readin' a new poem to her an' him. 'Twas a real pretty one, too, if I do say it as shouldn't. The best I ever done. All about how fame an' beauty an' pleasure didn't count nothin' besides workin'. I got the idea out of somethin' I found in a magazine. 'Twas just grand, an' it gave me the perspiration right away to turn it into a poem. An' I did, an' 'twas that I was readin'. I'd just got it done that mornin'." "Yes, yes," nodded Miss Dorothy. "I see. Well, I never thought of its meanin' anything to Keith, or of his takin' it nohow wrong. But after Mis' McGuire had gone home, she came out an' set with me a spell first in the kitchen. I heard a queer little noise in the sittin' room, an' I went an' looked in. Keith was at the table, his arms flung straight out in front of him, an' his head bowed down. An' Miss Dorothy, he was cryin' like a baby." "Oh, Susan, what did you do? What did you say?" "Say? Nothin'!" Susan's eyes flashed her scorn. "Do you suppose I'd let that poor lamb know I see him cryin'? Well, I guess not. I backed out as soft as a feather bed, an' I didn't go near that sittin' room for an hour, nor let any one else. I was a regular dragon fly guardin' it. Well, by an' by Keith comes out. His face was white an' strained lookin', but he was smilin', an' he handed out my poem. I'd left it on the table when I come out with Mis' McGuire. 'I found this paper on the table, Susan. It's your poem, isn't it?' he says real cheerful like. Then he turns kind of quick an' leaves the room without another word. Well, I didn't know then 'twas the poem he'd been cryin' over. I didn't know till this mornin'. Then somethin' he said made me see right off." "Why, Susan, what was it?" "'Twas somethin' about work. But first, you wouldn't understand it unless you see the poem. An' I can show it to you, 'cause I got it right here. I'm tryin' to memorialize it, so I keep it with me all the time an' repeat one line over an' over till I get it. It's right here in my bag. You'll find it's the best I've wrote, Miss Dorothy. I'm sure you will," she went on a bit wistfully. "You see, I used a lot of the words that was in the magazine. Not that I pleasurized it any, of course. Mine's different, 'cause mine is poetry an' theirs is prosy. There, I guess maybe you can read it, even if it's my writin'," she finished, taking a sheet of notepaper from her bag and carefully spreading it out for Miss Dorothy to read. And this is what Dorothy read: Contentment. Wealth. I asked for the earth, but when in my hands it shriveled and crumbled away, and the green of its trees and the blue of its skies changed to a somber gray. Beauty. I asked for the moon, but the shimmering thing was only reflected gold, and vanished away at my glance and touch, and was then but a tale that is told. Pleasure. I asked for the stars, and lots of them came and twinkled and danced for me, but the whirling light soon wearied my gaze. I quenched their flame in the sea. Fame. I asked for the sun, but the fiery ball, brought down from its home on high, scorched and blistered my fingertips as I swirled it back to the sky. Labor. I asked for a hoe, and I set me to work, and my red blood danced as I went. At night I rested, and looking back, I counted my day well spent. "But, Susan, I don't see," began Miss Dorothy, lifting puzzled eyes from the last line of the poem. "I don't see what there is about that to make Mr. Keith cry." "No, I didn't till this mornin', an' then well, Keith came out into the kitchen an' begun one of them tramps of his up an' down the room. It always drives me nearly crazy when he does that, but I can't say anything, of course. I did begin this morning to talk about John McGuire and how fine it was he'd got something he could do, and thought it would take the poor boy's mind off hisself if I could get him talking about John McGuire. He's been so interested in John all winter, and so glad he could help him. You know, he's always wanted to help somebody hisself instead of always having somebody helping him. But, dear me, instead of it being a quieter now for him, it was a regular stir-up. "That's just it. That's just it, Susan," he moans. "You've got to have your work or you die. There's nothing in the whole world like work. Your work. John McGuire's got his work, and I'm glad of it. But where's mine? Where's mine, I tell you?" And I told him he'd just been having his work, helping John McGuire. You know, it was wonderful, perfectly wonderful, Miss Dorothy, the way the two men got hold of John McGuire. You know John wouldn't speak to anybody, not anybody, till Keith and his father found some way to get on the inside of his shell. And Keith's been so happy all winter doing it, and his father, too. So I tried to remind him that he'd been doing his work. But it didn't do no good. Keith said that was all very well, and he was glad, of course, but that was only a little bit of a thing, and 'twas all past and gone, and John didn't need him any more, and there wasn't anything left for him now at all. Oh, Miss Dorothy, he talked awfully. I never heard him run on so, and I knew from a lot of it that he had said that he was thinking of that poem. He wouldn't ask for wealth or beauty or fame or anything, and that there didn't anything count but labor. You see? Yes, I see. Miss Dorothy's voice was very low. Her face was turned quite away, yet Susan was very sure there were tears in her eyes. And his father, he's most as bad as Keith, sighed Susan. They're both as nervous as witches, what with the war and all, and their not being able to do anything. Oh, they do give money, lots of it. Liberty bonds and Red Cross and drives, of course. You knew they'd got it now, their money, didn't you, Miss Dorothy? Yes, I'd heard so. Not that it seems to do 'em any particular good, complained Susan wistfully. Oh, of course things ain't so ambiguous as they was, and we have more to eat and wear and don't have to worry about bills. But they ain't any happier's I can see. If only Keith could find something. Yes, I know, sighed Miss Dorothy again, as she turned slowly away. I wish he could. Well, come to see us, won't you? Urged Susan anxiously. That'll help some. It'll help a lot. But Miss Dorothy did not seem to have heard. At least she did not answer. Yet not 24 hours later she was ringing the Burtons' doorbell. No, no, not there. I want to see you, she panted a little breathlessly when Susan would have led her away to the living room. But Keith would be so glad, begged Susan. No, no, I particularly don't want him to know I'm here, insisted Dorothy. And without further ado, but with rebellious lips and eyes, Susan led the way to the kitchen. Susan, I have a scheme I think that may help out Mr. Keith, began the young girl abruptly. I'll have to begin by telling you something of what I've seen during those last 2 or 3 months while I've been away. A Mr. Wilson, an old college friend of my father's, has been taking a lot of interest in the blind, especially since the war. He got to thinking of the blinded soldiers and wishing he could help them. He had seen some of them in Canada and talked with them. What he thought of first for them was brooms and basket weaving and chair caning, same as everybody does. But he found they had a perfect horror of those things. They said nobody bought such things except out of pity. They'd rather have the machine-made kind. And these men didn't want things bought of them out of pity. You see, they were big, well, strong young fellows like John McGuire here, and they were groping around trying to find a way to live all those long years of darkness that they knew were ahead of them. They didn't have any special talent, but they wanted to work, do something that was necessary, not be charity folks, as they called it. I know, responded Susan sympathetically. Well, this Mr. Wilson is at the head of a big electrical machinery manufacturing company near Chicago, like Mr. Sanborn's here, you know. And suddenly, one day, it came to him that he had the very thing right in his own shop. a necessary kind of work that the blind could be taught to do. My land, what was it? Think of blind folks going to work in a big shop like Tom Sanborn's. I know, but there was something. It was wrapping the coils of wire with tape. Mr. Wilson said they used hundreds of thousands of these coils all the time, and they had to be wrapped to insulate them. It was this work that he believed the blind could learn to do. Anyhow, he was determined to try it, and try it he did. He sent for those soldiers he had talked with in Canada, and he took 2 or 3 of Father's patients and opened a little winding room with a good electrical engineer in charge. And do you know, it was wonderful the way those poor fellows took hold of that work. Why, they got really skillful in no time, and they learned to do it swiftly, too. My land, breathed Susan again. They did. He took me in to see them one day. It was just a big room on the ground floor of an office building. He didn't put 'em in his shop. He said he wanted to keep them separate, for the present, anyway. It had 2 or 3 long tables, and the superintendent moved up and down the room overseeing their work and helping where it was necessary. There was a new man that morning, and it was perfectly wonderful how he took hold of it. And they were all so happy, laughing and talking and having the best time ever. But they sobered up real earnest when Mr. Wilson introduced 1 or 2 of them to me. One man in particular. He was one of the soldiers, a splendid, great, blond fellow 6 feet tall and only 21. Told me what this work meant to them, how glad they were to feel of real use in the world. Then his face flushed and his shoulders straightened a bit. "And we're even helping a little to win the war," he said. "For these coils we're winding now are for some armatures to go in some big motors that are going to be used in making munitions. So you see we are helping a little." Bless his heart, he didn't know how much he was helping everyone just by his big, brave courage. Well, Susan, all this gave me an idea, after what you said yesterday about Mr. Keith, and I wondered why couldn't he wind coils too? And maybe he'd get others to do it also. So I went to Mr. Sanborn, and he's perfectly willing to let us give it a trial. He's pleased and interested, and says he will furnish everything for the experiment, including a first-class engineer to superintend it. Only he can't spend any time over it himself, and we'll have to get somebody else to take charge and make arrangements about the place and the starting of it, and all that. And, Susan, now comes my second idea. Could we, do you suppose, we could get Mr. Daniel Burton to take charge of it? Oh, Miss Dorothy, if only we could! It would be so fine for Mr. Keith and for all the others. I've been hearing everywhere how wonderfully he got hold of John McGuire. He did, cried Susan. And he's like a different man all the time he was doing it. He hadn't no use for his painting lately, and he's been so uneasy. I'm sure he'll do it, if you ask him. Good. Then I will. Is he home to-day? Yes, he's upstairs. I'll call him. Susan sprang to her feet with alacrity. But, Susan, just a minute. Miss Dorothy had put out a detaining hand. Is Mr. Keith here, too? Yes, both of 'em. Keith's in the sitting room, and I'll call his father down. 'Twon't take but just a minute. Susan was plainly chafing at the detaining hand. No, no, Susan. Miss Dorothy, too, had sprung to her feet. If Mr. Keith is here, I'll wait. I want to see Mr. Daniel Burton first, alone, to tell him about it, you know," she added hastily, as Susan began to frown her disappointment. "But I don't see why," argued Susan, her disapproving eyes on the girl's flushed cheeks. "I should think you'd want to talk it up with both of 'em." Yes, of course, but not at first," stammered Miss Dorothy, plainly growing more and more embarrassed as she tried to appear less so. "I would rather that is, I think it would be better to ask Mr. Daniel Burton first, and then after we get it well started, let him tell his son. So I'll come by to-morrow in the morning at 10. Mr. Keith is with Mr. John McGuire then, isn't he? And over at his house? I heard he was." "Yes, he is, most generally." "Then I'll come then. If you'll tell Mr. Daniel Burton, please," hurried on Miss Dorothy, "and ask him to see me. And please, please keep it from Mr. Keith, Susan. truly I don't want him to know a thing about it until his father and I have got it all fixed up," she finished. "But, Miss Dorothy, I know that Keith would want to—" "Susan!" With an imperiousness quite foreign to her usual manner, Miss Dorothy cut in sharply. "If you don't promise to speak only to Mr. Daniel Burton about this matter, I shall not come at all." "Oh, land sakes! Well, well, have it your own way," snapped Susan. "You promise?" "Yes, I promise." Susan's lips obeyed her, but her eyes were still mutinous. "Good. Thank you, Susan. Then I'll come to morrow at 10," nodded Miss Dorothy once again, her smiling, gracious self, as she turned to leave the room. Chapter 29. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 30 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 30. Daniel Burton's Job. Dorothy came at 10, or, to be strictly accurate, at 5 minutes past 10. The additional 5 minutes had been consumed by her going out of her way around the block so that she might see if Keith were visible in one of the McGuires' windows. He was visible, and when she went up the Burton walk at 5 minutes past 10, her step was confident and her face eager, and there was about her manner none of the furtive, nervous questioning that had marked her coming the day before. "Good morning, Susan," she began cheerily, as Susan answered her ring. "Did Mr. Burton say he would see me?" "He did. And Mr. Keith is over at the McGuires' all safe, so you don't have to worry about him." Susan's eyes were still mutinous, her voice still coldly disapproving. "Yes, I know he is," nodded Miss Dorothy with a bright smile. "Oh, you do?" "Yes. Well, that is, I—" Under Susan's uncompromising frigidity, Miss Dorothy's stammering tongue came to a painful pause. "Humph!" vouchsafed Susan. "Well, come in, and I'll tell Mr. Daniel Burton you're here." The emphasis on Daniel was not lost, was shown by the sudden broad smile that chased away the confusion on Miss Dorothy's face, as Susan led the way to the living room. 2 minutes later Daniel Burton, thinner, paler, and more worn-looking than Dorothy had ever seen him before, entered the room and held out a cordial hand.
"Good morning, Miss Dorothy. I'm glad to see you," he said. "What is it? Red Cross? YMCA? Smilage books?" The whimsical smile on his lips only served to emphasize the somber pain in his eyes.
"Not any of them. Then Susan didn't tell you?"
"Not a word. Sit down, please."
"Thank you. Then I shall have to begin at the beginning," sighed the girl a little constrainedly, as she took the chair he offered her. I have a certain project that I want to carry out, Mr. Burton, and I want your help."
"Why, of course, certainly. I shall be glad to, I know."
Daniel Burton's hand had already reached for his checkbook.
"Any project of yours, Miss Dorothy? How much do you want?"
But Miss Dorothy lifted her hand, palm outward. "Thank you, Mr. Burton, but not any in money just yet. Oh, it'll take money, probably, to get it started, before it's on a self-supporting basis, I suppose. But it isn't money I want to day, Mr. Burton. It's yourself." The man gave a short, dry laugh, not untinged with bitterness.
"I'm afraid I can't endorse either your taste or your judgment here, Miss Dorothy. You've come for a poor sick. I can't imagine myself as being much benefit to any sort of project. However, I shall be glad to hear about it, of course. What is it?"
And Miss Dorothy told him. With her eyes shining and her voice quivering with eagerness, she told the story as she had told Susan the afternoon before, but with even greater elaboration of detail. "And so now, Mr. Burton, you will help, won't you?" she begged in closing.
"Help? My dear girl, how?"
"Take charge. Be the head and shoulders, the backbone of the whole thing. Oh, yes, I know it's a whole lot to ask," she hurried on as she saw the dawning dismay and refusal on his face. "But I thought, for the sake of the cause—"
"The cause?"
The man's voice was bitter as he interrupted her.
"I'd crawl to France on my hands and knees if that would do any good. But, my dear young lady, I'm an ignoramus, and worse than an ignoramus. When it comes to machinery, I'll venture to wager that I wouldn't know the tape from the coils, or whatever they are."
"Oh, we'd have an engineer for that part, of course," interposed the girl eagerly. "And we want your son, too."
"You want Keith? Pray, do you expect him to teach how to wind coils?"
"No, no, not exactly, though I think he will be teaching before he realizes it. I want him to learn to wind them himself, and thus get others to learn. You don't understand, Mr. Burton. I want you and Keith to do just what you did for John McGuire, arouse interest and enthusiasm and get them to do it. Don't you see?"
"But that was Keith, not I, in the case of John McGuire."
"It was you at the last," corrected the girl gently. "Mr. Burton, John McGuire wouldn't have any book out this spring if it weren't for you and your eyes."
Perhaps not. Still, there'd have been a way, probably. But even if I grant that, all you say in the case of John McGuire, that isn't winding armatures, or whatever they are."
"Mr. Burton, you aren't going to refuse?" pleaded the girl.
"What else can I do, Miss Dorothy? You don't want to stamp this project of yours a failure from the start, do you?"
Words, voice, manner, and gesture were unmistakable. All the longing and heartache and bitterness of the years of fruitless effort and final disappointment pulsated through that one word, failure. For a moment nobody spoke. Daniel Burton had got to his feet and crossed the room to the window. The girl, watching him with compassionate eyes as he stood looking out, had caught her breath with a little choking sigh. Suddenly she lifted her head resolutely. "Mr. Burton, you've got one gift that I don't believe you realize at all you possess. Like John McGuire, you make folks see what you are talking about. Perhaps it's because you can paint pictures with a brush, or perhaps it's because you've got such a wonderful command of words." Miss Dorothy stumbled a little precipitately into this sentence. She had not failed to see the disdainful movement of the man's head and shoulders at the mention of his pictures. "Whatever it is," she hurried on, "you've got it. I saw it first years ago, with your son. When I used to see him at father's, he would sit and talk to me by the hour about the woods and the fields and the mountains and sunsets and flowers back home, and little by little I found out that they were the pictures you drew for him on the canvas of his soul. You've done it again now for John McGuire. Do you suppose you could have caught those wonderful stories of his with your pencil if you hadn't been able to help him visualize them for himself? You and Keith together with your wonderful enthusiasm and interest? I know you couldn't, and that's why I want you now for you and your son, because he's blind and knows and understands as no seeing person can know and understand. They will trust him. They will follow where he leads. But behind him has got to be you. You've got to be the eyes for them all. Not to teach the work. We'll have others for that. Any good mechanic will do for that part. But it's the other part of it, the soul of the thing. These men, lots of them, are but little more than boys. Big, strong, strapping fellows with the whole of life before them. And they are blind. Whichever way they turn, a big black curtain shuts them in. And it's those four black curtains that I want you to paint. I want you to give them something to look at, something to think of, something to live for. And you can do it. And when you've done it, you'll find they're the best and the biggest pictures you ever painted." Her voice broke with the last word and choked into silence. Over at the window the man stood motionless. 1 minute, 2 minutes passed. Then a bit abruptly he turned, crossed the room to the girl's side, and held out his hand. "Miss Dorothy, I'll take the job," he said. He spoke lightly, and he smiled as he said the words, but neither the smile nor the lightness of his manner quite hid the shake in his voice nor the moisture in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Burton. I was sure you would," cried the girl.
"And now for Keith. He's over at the McGuires'. I'll get him," explained the man boyishly. But Miss Dorothy was instantly on her feet.
"No, no, please," she begged a little breathlessly. "I'd rather you didn't now. I think we'd better get a little farther along before we tell him. There's a whole lot to do, you know, getting the room and the materials and the superintendent and all that. And there isn't a thing he can do yet."
All right. Very good. Perhaps that would be better," nodded the man. "But let me tell you, I already have some workers for your project."
You mean Jack Green? Here in town?
"No. Oh, we'd want him, of course. But it's some others, a couple of boys from Hillsboro. I had a letter yesterday from the father of one of the boys, asking what to do with his son. He thought because of Keith that I could help him. It was a pitiful letter. The man was heartbroken and utterly at sea. His boy, only 19, had come home blind and well nigh crazed with the tragedy of it, and the father didn't know which way to turn. That's why he appealed to me, you see, on account of Keith."
Yes, I understand, said the girl gently, as the man left his sentence unfinished.
"I've had others, too. Several of them in the last few weeks. If you'll wait, I'll get the letters." He was already halfway to the door. "It may take a minute or two to look them up, but they'll be worth it, I think."
Of course they will, she cried eagerly. They'll be just exactly what we want, and I'm not in a bit of a hurry, she finished, dropping back in her chair as the door closed behind him. Alone, she looked over the room, her eyes wistful, brimming with unshed tears. Over by the window was Keith's chair, before it the table with a half-completed picture puzzle spread upon it. Near the table was a set of shelves containing other picture puzzles, games, and books, all, as the girl well knew, especially designed and constructed for eyes that could not see. She had risen to her feet and half started to cross the room towards the table when the door to the side hall opened and Keith Burton entered the room. With a half-stifled gasp the girl stepped back to her chair. The blind boy stopped instantly, his face turned toward her.
"Is that you, Susan?"
The girl wet her lips, but no words came.
"Who's there, please?"
He spoke sharply this time, as everybody knew who knew Keith. The one thing that angered him more than anything else was the attempted deception as to one's presence in the room. Miss Dorothy gave a confused little laugh and put her hand to her throat. "Why, Keith, it's only I. Don't look so
"You!"
For one brief moment his face lighted up as with a hidden flame. Then instantly it changed. It became like the gray of ashes after the flame is spent.
"Why didn't you speak then?" he questioned. "It did no good to keep quiet. You mustn't forget that I have ears. I haven't eyes."
"Nonsense, Keith!" She laughed again, confusedly, though her own face had paled a little. "I did speak as soon as I caught my breath. Popping in on a body like that!"
"But I didn't know you were here," stammered the young fellow uncertainly. "Nobody called me. I beg your pardon if—" He came to a helpless pause.
"Not a bit of it. You needn't. It wasn't necessary at all." The girl tossed off the words with a lightness so forced that it was almost flippancy. "You see, I didn't come to see you at all. It was your father."
"My father?"
"Certainly."
But does he know?"
The girl laughed merrily, too merrily for sincerity. "No, indeed he does. We've just been having a lovely talk. He's gone upstairs for some letters. He's coming right back. Right back."
Oh!"
Was it an indefinable something in her voice, or was it the repetition of the last two words? Whatever it was that caused it, Keith turned away with a jerk, walked with the swift sureness of long familiarity straight to the set of shelves, and took down a book.
"Then I'll not disturb you any further, as long as you're not needing me," he said tersely. "I only came for this."
And with barely a touch of his cane to the floor and door casing, he strode from the room. The pity of it, that he could not have seen Dorothy Parkman's eyes looking after him. End of chapter 30. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 31 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 31. What Susan Did Not See. There was apparently no limit to Daniel Burton's enthusiastic cooperation with Dorothy Parkman on the matter of establishing a workroom for the blind. He set to work with her at once. The very next morning after her initial visit he went with her to Mazie Sanborn's father, and together they formulated the first necessary plans. Thomas Sanborn was generous and cordially enthusiastic, though his words and manner carried the crisp terseness of a busy man whose time is money. At the end of 5 minutes he summoned one David Patch to the office and introduced him to Miss Dorothy and Daniel Burton as one of his most expert engineers.
"And now I'll turn the whole thing over to you," he declared briskly,
with his finger already on the button that would summon his stenographer for dictation.
"Just step into that room there and stay as long as you like. Whatever Patch says, I'll back up. You'll find him thoroughly capable and trustworthy. And now, good luck to you," he finished, throwing wide the door of the adjoining room.
The next moment Miss Dorothy and Daniel Burton found themselves alone with the keen-eyed, alert little man who had been introduced as David Patch. And David Patch did, indeed, appear to be very capable. He evidently understood his business, and he gave interested attention to Miss Dorothy's story of what she had seen and of what she wished now to try to do. He took them then for a tour of the great shop, especially to the department where the busy fingers were winding with tape the thousands of wire coils. Miss Dorothy's eyes sparkled with excitement, and she fairly clapped her hands in delight, while Daniel Burton said that even he could see the possibilities of that kind of work for their purpose. At the end of a long hour of talking and planning, Miss Dorothy and Daniel Burton started for home. But even then Daniel Burton had yet more to say, for at his gate, which was on Miss Dorothy's way home, he begged her to come in for a moment.
"I had another letter to-day about the blind soldier, this time from Baltimore. I want to show it to you. You see, so many write to me on account of my own boy. You will come in just a minute?"
"Why, yes, of course I will." The pause and the half-stifled word that finished the sentence came as the tall figure of Keith Burton turned the corner of the piazza and walked toward the steps.
"Hello, Dad?"
Keith's voice was questioning.
"Yes, and
"And Dorothy Parkman," broke in the girl, with a haste so precipitate as to make her almost choke.
Miss Parkman?"
Once again, for a moment, Keith's face lighted as with flame. Come around to the South Side," he cried eagerly. "I've been sunning myself there. You'd think it was May instead of March."
"No, she can't go and sun herself with you," interposed Daniel Burton with mock severity. "She's coming with me into the house. I want to show her something." "Well, I like that," retorted the youth. He spoke jauntily and gave a short little laugh, but the light had died from his face and a slow red had crept to his forehead. "Well, she can't. She's coming with me," reiterated the man. "Now run back to your sun bath. If you're good, maybe we'll be out pretty soon." He laughed back at his son as he opened the house door for his guest. "That's right. You didn't want him to know yet, did you?" he added, looking a bit anxiously into the girl's somewhat flushed face as he closed the hall door.
"Quite right. No, I don't want him to know yet. There's so much to be done to get started, and he'd want to help. And he couldn't help about that part, and 'twould only fret him and make him unhappy."
"My idea exactly," nodded the man. "When we get the room and the goods there, we'll want to tell him then."
"Of course you'll tell him then," cried the girl.
"Yes, indeed, of course we will,"
exclaimed the man, very evidently not noticing the change in the pronoun.
"Now, if you'll wait a minute, I'll get that letter. Then we'll go out to Keith on the piazza."
It was a short letter, and one quickly read, and very soon they were out on the piazza again. But Miss Dorothy said "No, no," very hastily, when he urged her to go round the other side, and she added, "I really must go home now," as she hurried down the steps. Daniel Burton went then around the corner of the piazza to explain her absence to his son Keith. But he need not have hurried. His son Keith was not there. For all the good progress that was made on that first day, things seemed to move a bit slowly after that. To begin with, the matter of selecting suitable room gave no little difficulty. The right room in the right location seemed not to be had, and Daniel Burton even suggested that they use some room in his own house. But after a little thought he gave up the idea as being neither practical nor desirable. Meanwhile, he was in daily communication with Dorothy Parkman, and they spent 2 hours together thrashing out the different problems one by one as they arose, sometimes at her home, more frequently at his. For home to Dorothy in Hinsdale meant the Sanborn house, where Mazie was always in evidence. And Daniel Burton did not care for Mazie. Especially he did not care for her advice and assistance on the problems that were puzzling him now. To be sure, at his own home there was Keith, but he contrived to avoid Keith on most occasions. Besides, Keith himself seemed quite inclined to keep out of the way, particularly if he heard the voice of Dorothy Parkman, which did not disturb Daniel Burton in the least, under the circumstances. Till they got ready to tell Keith, he was rather glad that he did keep so conveniently out of the way. And as Dorothy seemed always glad to avoid seeing Keith or talking to him, there was really very little trouble on that score, and they could have their consultations in peace and quietness. And there were so many of them, those consultations. When at last the room was found, there were the furnishings to select and the final plans to be made for the real work to be done. David Patch proved himself to be invaluable then. As if by magic a long table appeared, and the coils and the tape and all the various paraphernalia of the property-equipped winding-room marched smoothly into place. Meanwhile 3 soldiers and 1 civilian stood ready and eager to be taught, needing only the word of command to begin. "And now we'll tell Keith," said Daniel Burton. "Yes, now you must tell Keith," said Miss Dorothy. "To-morrow at 9." "To-morrow at 9," bowed Miss Dorothy.
"I'll bring him down and we'll show him."
"And I do so hope he'll like it."
"Of course he'll like it," cried Daniel Burton. "You wait and see."
But she did not see. She was not there to see. Promptly at 9 o'clock Daniel Burton appeared in the winding room with Keith, but Dorothy Parkman was nowhere in sight. He waited 10-15 minutes. Then he told Keith the story of the room and what they'd hoped to do there, fuming meanwhile within himself because he had to tell it alone. But it was not lack of interest that kept Miss Dorothy away. It could not have been, for that very afternoon she sought Daniel Burton out and asked eagerly what his son had said and how he had taken it. And her eyes shone and her breath quickened at the story Daniel Burton told, and so eager was she to know every little word that had fallen from Keith's lips that she kept Daniel Burton repeating over and over each minute detail. Yet the next day, when Keith and 4 other blind youths began work in earnest, she never once went near Keith's chair, though she went often to the others, dropping here and there a word of encouragement or a touch of aiding fingers. When night came, however, and she found an opportunity for a few words alone with Daniel Burton, she told him that, in her opinion, Keith had done the best work of the 5, and that it was perfectly marvelous the way he was taking hold. And again her eyes sparkled and her breath quickened, and she spent the entire 10 minutes talking about Keith to his father. Yet the next day, when the work began again, she still went to the back of every chair but Keith's. Things happened very rapidly after that. It was not a week before the first long table in the big room was filled with eager workers, and the second one had to be added to take care of the newcomers. The project was already the talk of the town, and not the least excited and interested of the observers was John McGuire's mother. When the news came of the second table being added to the equipment of the place, she hurried over to Susan's kitchen without delay, though with the latest poem of her son as the ostensible excuse. "It's the stumbling block," she announced. "He just got it done yesterday, and I copied it for you. I think it's the best yet," she beamed, handing over a folded paper. "It's kind of long, so don't stop to read it now. Say, is it true? Have they had to put another table at that blind windin' room?" "They have." "Well, if that ain't the greatest! I think it's just grand. They took my son John down there to see the place yesterday, do you know? That boy is such a different being since his book and his writin', and he's learnin' to do such a lot of things for himself, and he's so happy in it. And he doesn't mind seein' anybody now. And it's all owin' to your wonderful Keith and his father. I wouldn't ever have believed it of them." Susan's chin came up a bit. "I would. I knew. And I always told you that Daniel Burton was a superlative man in every way, and his son just like him. Only you wouldn't believe me." "Nobody'd believe you," maintained Mrs. McGuire spiritedly. "Nobody'd believe such a thing could be as my John being changed like that, and all those others down in the winding room, too. They say it's perfectly marvelous that Keith and his father are doing with those men and boys. Aren't they awfully happy over it? Keith and his father, I mean." Daniel Burton is. Why, he's like a different man, Mis' McGuire. You'd know that jest to see him walk an' hear him speak. An' I don't hear nothin' more about his longin' to get over there. I guess he thinks he's got work enough to do right here, an' he hardly ever touches his war maps these days." "But ain't Keith happy, too?"
"Yes, an' no," hesitated Susan, her face clouding a little. "Oh, he's gone into it heart an' soul, an' while he's workin' on somethin' he's all right. But when it's all quiet an' he's sittin' alone, I don't like the look on his face. But I know he's glad to be helpin' down there, an' I know it's helpin' him, too."
"It's helping everybody, not forgetting Miss Dorothy Parkman," added Miss McGuire with a smile and a shrug, as she rose to go. "But then, of course, we all know what she's after."
"After? What do you mean?"
"Susan Betts." With a jerk Mrs. McGuire faced about.
"It ain't possible, with eyes in your head, that you ain't seen." "Seen what?"
"Well, my land! With that girl throwing herself at Daniel Burton's head for the last 6 weeks, and you calmly sit there and ask, 'Seen what?' Daniel Burton! Dorothy Parkman!" There's no mistaking Susan's dumbfounded amazement. "Yes, Daniel Burton and Dorothy Parkman. Oh, I used to think it was Keith. But when the money came to old Daniel, I guess she thought he wasn't so old after all. Besides, Keith with his handicap, you couldn't blame the girl after all, I s'pose." "Daniel Burton and Dorothy Parkman!" repeated Susan, this time with the faintness of stupefaction. "Why, Susan, you must have seen it, her running in here every day, walking home with him, and talking to him every chance she gets." "But they've been making plans for the work," murmured Susan. "Work? Well, I guess it no need to have taken quite so many consultations just for the work. Besides, she never thought of such a scheme as this before the money came, did she? Not much, she did. Oh, come, Susan, wake up. She'll be walking off with him right under your nose if you don't look out," finished Mrs. McGuire with a sly laugh as she took her departure. Left alone, Susan sat for some time absorbed in thought, a deep frown on her face. Then, with a sigh and a shrug, as if throwing off an incomprehensible burden, she opened the paper Mrs. McGuire had left with her. Once, twice, 3 times she read the verses. Then, with a low chuckle, she folded up the paper, tucked it into her apron pocket, and rose to her feet. A minute later she had attacked the pile of dishes in the sink and was singing lustily. "I've taken my worries, I've taken my woes, I have, and shutting up where nobody knows, I have. I chucked 'em down, that's what I did, and now I'm sitting upon the lid, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. I'm sitting upon the lid, I am, hurrah, hurrah. I'm trying to be a little lamb, hurrah, hurrah. But I'm feeling more like a great big slam than a nice little peaceful woolly lamb. But we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home." End of chapter 31. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 32 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 32. The Key. There was no work in the winding room Saturday afternoons, and it was on Saturday afternoon that Susan found Keith sitting idle-handed in his chair by the window in the living room. As was her custom, she spoke the moment she entered the room, but not before she had noted the listless attitude and wistful face of the youth over by the window. "Keith, I've been thinking."
"Bad practice, Susan, sometimes," he laughed whimsically.
"Not this time."
"Poetry?" She shook her head.
"No, I ain't poetsin' so much these days, though I did write one yesterday about the ways of the world. I'm going to read it to you, too, by and by. But that's just a common poem about common, everyday folks. And this thing I was thinking about was different."
"And so you couldn't put this into a poem, huh?" Susan shook her head again and sighed.
"No, and it's been that way lots of times lately, 'specially since I seen John McGuire's poems so fine and beautimous. Oh, I have the perspiration to write lots of times, and I yield up to it and write. But somehow, when it's done, I ain't said a mite of what I wanted to, and I ain't said it the way I want to, either. I think maybe havin' so many of 'em declined by them editors had made me kinder fearsome."
"I'm afraid it has, Susan," he smiled.
"Now, this afternoon, what I was thinkin' about, once I'd have made a poem of that easy. But to day I didn't even try. I knew I couldn't do it. And say, Keith, it was you I was thinkin' about."
"Heavens, Susan, a poem out of me? No wonder your muse balked. I'm afraid you'd find even perspiration wouldn't make a poem out of me."
"Keith, do you remember?" Susan was still earnest and preoccupied. "I told you once, and it didn't make no difference if God had closed the door of your eyes. He'd open up another room to you some time and give you the key to unlock the door. And He has. And now you've got it, that key."
"I've got it? The key?"
"Yes. That's work down there, helpin' them blind men and boys get hold of their souls again. Oh, Keith, don't you see? It's such a big, wide room that God has given you, and it's all yours. There ain't no one that can help them poor blind soldiers like you can. And you couldn't 'a' done it if that door of your eyes hadn't been shut first. And that was what give you the key to this big, beautiful room of helpin' our boys that's come back to us blinded and half crazed with despair and discouragement. Oh, if only I could make you see it the way I do! But if I can't say it the right way, there's such a big, beautiful idea there. If only I could make you see it. That's why I wanted to write the poem."
"I can see it, Susan, without the poem." Keith was not smiling now. His face was turned away and his voice had grown a bit unsteady. "And I'm glad you showed it to me. It's going to help me a whole lot if I just keep remembering that key, I think." Susan threw a quick look into Keith's averted face. Then promptly she reached for the folded paper in her apron pocket. There were times when Susan was wise beyond her station as to when the subject should be changed.
"And now I'm going to read you the poem I did write," she announced briskly. "About everyday folks, different kind of folks. 6 of 'em. It shows that there ain't any one anywhere that's really satisfied with their lot when you come right down to it, whether they've got eyes or not." And she began to read: "The Way of the World. A beggar girl on the curbstone sat, all ragged and hungry-eyed. Across the street came Peggy McGee. The beggar girl saw and sighed. I wished I was rich as she, for she has got things to eat, and clothes and shoes and a place to live, and she don't beg in the street." When Peggy McGee the corner turned, she climbed to her garret high. From there she gazed through curtainless panes, a hanging of lace near by. "Ah, me," sighed Peggy, "if I had those, and rugs like hers on the floor, it seems to me that I'd never ask for nothin' at all no more." From those curtains that selfsame day looked a face all sour and thin. "I hate to live in this horrid street, in the children's yellin' din. And where's the good of my nice new things when nobody'll see or know? I really think that I ought to be a livin' in Rich Man's Row." A carriage came from Rich Man's Row and rumbled by to the park. A lady sat on the carriage seat. "Oh, dear," she said, "what an ark! If only this coach could show some style, my clothes so shabby would pass. Now there's an auto quite my kind, but 'tisn't my own, alas." The auto carried a millionaire whose brow was knotted and stern. "A million is nowhere now," thought he. "That's something we all must learn. 'Tis millions many one has to be in the swim at all. This trying to live when one is so poor is really all folderol." A man of millions was just behind. The beggar was passin' by. Business at beggin' was good that day, and the girl was eatin' pie. The rich man looked, and he groaned aloud, and swore with his gouty pain, "I'd give my millions and more beside, could I eat like that again." "Now, ain't that jest like folks?" demanded Susan as she finished the last verse.
Keith laughed. "I suspect it is, Susan. And by the way, I shouldn't wonder if this were quite the right time to show that I'm no different than other folks. You see, I, too, am going to make a change in living."
A change in living? What do you mean?
"Oh, not now, not quite yet. But you see, I've been doing some thinking, too. I've been thinking that if Father that is, when Father and Miss Parkman are married, that—" But Susan interrupted with a groan.
My sakes, Keith, have you seen it, too?
Keith laughed embarrassedly. "To be sure I have. You don't have to have eyes to see that, do you, Susan?"
Oh, good land, I don't know," whined Susan irritably. "I don't suppose—"
She did not finish her sentence, and after a moment's silence Keith began again to speak. "I've been talking a little to David Patch, the superintendent, you know. We're going to take the whole house where we are, for our work, pretty quick, and when we do, Patch and his wife will come there to live upstairs, and they'll take me to board. I asked them. Then I'll be right there handy all the time, you see, which will be a fine arrangement all around."
A fine arrangement, indeed, with you way off down there and living with David Patch."
"But, Susan," argued Keith, a bit wearily, "I couldn't be living here, you know."
"I should like to know why not."
"Because I couldn't." He had grown very white now. "Besides, I think they would be happier without me here, and I know I should be." His voice was low and almost indistinct, but Susan heard and understood. "The very fact that once I thought that I was foolish enough to think But, of course, as soon as I remembered my blindness, and to tie a beautiful young girl down to—" He stopped short and pulled himself up. "Susan, are you still there?"
"I'm right here, Keith."
Susan spoke constrainedly. He gave an embarrassed laugh. A painful red had suffused his face. "I'm afraid I got to talking and forgetting I wasn't alone," he stumbled on hurriedly. I mean to go on to say that I hope they'd be very happy. Dad deserves it. And if they'd only hurry up and get it over with, it would be easier for me. Not that it matters, of course. Dad has had an awful lot to put up with me already, as it is, you know. The trouble, the care, the disappointment. You see, I was going to make up to him for all he had lost. I was going to be Jerry and Ned and myself all in a bunch. And now it turned out to be nothing. And worse than nothing."
"Keith Burton, you stop!" It was the old imperious Susan back again. "You stop right where you be, and don't you never let me hear you say another word about you being a disappointment. Jerry and Ned, indeed! I wonder if you think a dozen Jerry and Neds could do what you've done. And no matter what they've done, they couldn't have done a bigger, splendider thing than you've done in triumphing over your blindness the way you've done, nor one that would make your father prouder of you. And let me tell you another thing, Keith Burton. No matter what you've done, no matter how many big pictures you painted or big books you wrote, or how much money you made for your dad, there ain't anything you could 'a' done that would do him so much solid good as what you have done."
"Why, Susan, are you wild? I haven't done a thing, not a thing for Dad."
"Yes, you have. You've done the biggest thing of all by needin' him."
"Needing him?"
"Yes, Keith Burton. Look at your father now. Look at the splendid work he's doing. You know as well as I do that he used to be a thoroughly insufficient, uncapacious man. I thought I wouldn't let anybody else say it. Puttering over a mess of pictures that wouldn't sell for a nickel, and that he used to run from anything and everything that was unproprietous and disagreeable, like he was being chased. Well, then, you was took blind. And what happened? You know what happened. He came right up and toed the mark like a man and a gentleman, and he's toed it ever since. And I can tell you that the pictures he's paintin' now with his tongue for them poor blind boys to see is bigger and better than any pictures he could have painted with his pygmy paints if he worked on them for 1,000 years. And it's you that's done it for him, just by needin' him. So there!" And before Keith could so much as open his lips, Susan was gone, slamming the door behind her. End of chapter 32. Recording by Sunny. Chapter 33 of Dawn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sunny. Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter. Chapter 33. And All on Account of Susan. Not one wink did Susan Betts sleep that night. To Susan her world was tumbling about her ears in one dizzy whirl of destruction. Daniel Burton and Dorothy Parkman married and living there, and her beloved blind boy banished to a home with one David Patch? Unthinkable! And yet, well, if it had got to be, it had got to be, she supposed, the marriage. But they might at least be decent about it. As for keeping that poor blind boy harrowed up all the time and prolonging the agony, well, at least she could do something about that, thank goodness, and she would, too. When there was anything that Susan could do, particularly in the line of righting a wrong, she lost no time in doing it. Within 2 days, therefore, she made her opportunity and grasped it. A little peremptorily, she informed Miss Dorothy Parkman that she would like to speak to her, please, in the kitchen. Then, tall and cold and very stern, she faced her. "Of course I understand, Miss Dorothy, I'm bustin' here where I ain't no business to, and ain't no excuse to offer except my boy Keith. It's for him I'm askin' you to do it." "To do what, Susan?" She had changed color slightly as she asked the question. "Not to let it be so plain. The love-making." "Scene? Love-making?" gasped the girl. "Well, the talkin' to him and the whisperin' and consultin's and runnin' here every day and—" "I beg your pardon, Susan," interrupted the girl incisively. She had grown very white. "I'm tempted to make no sort of reply to such an absurd accusation. But I'm going to say, however, that you must be laboring under some mistake. I do not come here to see Mr. Keith Burton, and I've scarcely exchanged a dozen words with him for months." "I'm talking about Mr. Daniel, not Keith, and—" "Mr. Daniel Burton!" "Of course! Who else?" Susan was nettled now, and showed it. "I don't suppose you'd deny running here to see him and talking to him and—" "No, no, wait. Don't say any more, please." The girl was half laughing, half crying. Her face was going from white to red and back to white again. "Am I to understand that I'm actually being accused of running after Mr. Daniel Burton? Of love-making towards him?" she choked incoherently. "Why, yes. That is, oh, this is too much, too much. First Keith, and now—" She broke off hysterically. "To think that, oh, Susan, how could you? How could you?" And by this time she dropped into her chair and covered her face with her hands. But she was laughing. Very plainly she was laughing. Susan frowned, stared, and frowned again. "Then you ain't in love with—" Suddenly her face cleared and broke into a broad smile. "Well, my lan', if that ain't the best joke ever! Of course you ain't in love with him. I don't believe I ever more'n half believed it, anyway. Now it'll be dead easy, an' all right, too." But what does that all mean?" stammered the girl. "Why, it's just that everybody thought you was after him, an' 'twould be a match, you bein' together so much. But even then I wouldn't have said a thing if it hadn't been for Keith." "Keith?" "Yes, poor boy. And it was hard for him, seeing you two together like this and thinking you cared for each other. And he's got his plans all made how, when you was married, he'd go and live with David Patch." "David Patch? But why?" "Why, don't you see? 'Twouldn't be very easy to see you married to another man, would it? And loving you all the time hisself, and—" "Loving me!" "That's what I said." Susan's lips came sharply together, and her keen eyes swept the girl's face. "But I think you must be mistaken again," faltered the girl, growing rosy.
"I ain't. I've always suspicioned it, an' now I know it."
"But he's acted as if he didn't care for me at all, as if he hated me."
"That's because he cared so much."
"Nonsense, Susan."
"'Tain't nonsense. It's sense. As I told you, I've always suspicioned it, an' last Saturday when I heard him talk, I knew. He was good as owned it up anyhow."
"But why didn't he tell me?" stammered the girl, growing still more rosy.
"Because he was blind."
"As if I minded!" She stopped abruptly and turned away her face. Susan drew a resolute breath and squared her shoulders.
"Then why don't you do something?" she demanded.
"Do something?"
"Yes, to show him that you don't mind."
"Oh, Susan, I couldn't do that."
"All right. Settle back then and do nothin', and he'll settle back and do nothin', and there'll be a pretty pair of you, eatin' your hearts out with love for each other, passin' each other by with converted faces and highbrow chins, and all because you're afraid of offendin' Mis' Grundy, who don't care no more about it than two sticks. But I suppose you'd both rather be miserable than brace up and defy the properties and live long and be happy ever after."
"But if I could be sure he cared," spoke the girl in a faint little voice.
"You would have been if you'd seen him Saturday, as I did."
"And if
If, if," interrupted Susan impatiently, "and there that poor blind boy sits and thinks and thinks and thinks, and longs for some one that loves him to smooth his pillow and rumple his hair and—"
"Susan, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it," vowed the girl, springing to her feet, her eyes like stars, her cheeks like twin roses.
"Do what?"
demanded Susan.
"I don't know, but I'm going to do something.
"Anyhow, whatever I do, I know I'm going to defy the properties," she babbled deliriously as she hurried from the room, looking very much as if she were trying to hide from herself. 4 days later, Keith, in his favorite chair, sat on the south piazza. It was an April day, but it was like June, and the window behind him was wide open into the living room. He did not hear Dorothy Parkman's light step up the walk. He did not know that she had paused at sight of him sitting there and had put her hand to her throat, and then that she had almost run, light-footed, into the house, again very much as if she were trying to run away from herself. But he did hear her voice 2 minutes later, speaking just inside the window. At the first sentence he tried to rise. Then, with a despairing gesture, as if realizing that flight would be worse than to remain where he was, he sat back in his chair. And this is what he heard Dorothy Parkman say. "No, no, Mr. Burton, please. I can't marry you. You'll have to understand. No, don't speak. Don't say anything, please. There's nothing you can say that would make a bit of difference. It's just that I don't love you, and I do love somebody else. Keith, your son. Yes, you've guessed it. Oh, yes, I know we don't seem to be much to each other now, but whether we ever are or not, there can't ever be any one else. And I think he cares. It's just that his pride won't let him speak, as if his dear eyes didn't make me love him. But I mustn't say all this to you. It's just that I wanted you to surely understand. And I must go. Now I must go." And she went. She went hurriedly, a little noisily. She shut one door and another. Then, out on the piazza, she came face to face with Keith Burton.
"Dorothy! Oh, Dorothy, I heard!"
And then it was well, indeed, that the Japanese screen on the front piazza was down, for Keith stood with his arms outstretched, and Dorothy, with an ineffable, contented little indrawn breath, walked straight into them. And with that light on his face, she would have walked into them had he been standing in the middle of the sidewalk outside. To Dorothy, at that moment, nobody in all the world counted for a feather's weight, except the man who was holding her close, with his lips to hers. Later, a little later, when they sat side by side on the piazza settee, and when coherence and logic had become attributes to their conversation, Keith sighed with a little catch in his voice.
"The only thing I regret about all this,
The only thing that makes me feel cheap and mean is that I've won where Dad lost out. Poor old Dad." There was the briefest of pauses. Then a small, subdued voice said, I suspect, Keith, confession is good for the soul."
"Well?"
he demanded in evident mystification. "Anyhow,
I'll have to do it. Your father wasn't there at all."
"But I heard you speaking to him, my dear."
She shook her head and stole a look into his face, then caught her breath with a little choking sob of heartache because he could not see the love she knew was in her eyes. But the heartache only nerved her to say the words that almost refused to come. He wasn't there," she repeated, fencing for time.
"But who was there? I heard you call him by name, Mr. Burton. Clearly, distinctly. I know I did."
But he wasn't there. Nobody was there. I was just talking to myself."
"You mean practicing what you were going to say?" questioned Keith doubtfully. "And that he doesn't know yet that you are going to refuse him?"
No, no. Well, yes, that is, I mean, it's true. He doesn't know I'm going to refuse him." There was a hint of smoldering laughter in the girl's voice.
"Dorothy!"
The arm about her waist perceptibly loosened and almost fell away.
"Why, I don't feel now that you have belonged to me yet. And I think of poor Dad."
The girl caught her breath and stole another look into his face. "But, Keith, you don't understand. He hasn't proposed to me yet. That is, I mean," she amended hastily, "he isn't going to propose to me ever."
"But he was. He cares. And now he'll have to know about us."
"But he wasn't. He doesn't. You don't understand, Keith. He never thought of proposing to me. I know he didn't."
"Then what Dorothy, what do you mean by all this?"
"Why, it's just that is oh, Keith, why will you make me tell you?" she cried between hysterical little laughs and sobs. "And yet I'd have to tell you, of course. I knew you were there on the porch, and I knew you'd hear what I said, and so to make you understand. Oh, Keith, it was awful, but I pretended that—"
"You darling!" breathed an impassioned voice into her ear. "Oh, how I love you for that!"
"Oh, but Keith, it really was awful of me," she cried, blushing and laughing as she emerged from his embrace. "Susan told me to divide the properties, and I did."
"Susan?"
She nodded. "That's how I knew for sure that you cared."
"And so I owe it all, even my proposal of marriage to Susan?" he bantered mischievously.
"Keith, I did not it was not a proposal of marriage."
"No, but you're going to marry me, aren't you?" Her chin came up.
I shall wait till I'm asked," she retorted with dignity.
Well, I reckon it's safe to say you'll be asked. And so I owe it all to Susan. Well, it isn't the first good thing I've owed to her, bless her heart, and she's equal to most anything. But I'll wager in this case that even Susan had some stunt to perform. How did she do it?"
"She told me that you thought your father and I cared for each other, and that you cared for me, but that you were very brave and you were going to go away and leave us to our happiness. Then, when she found there was nothing to the other part of it, and that I cared for you, well, I don't know how she did it, but she said, well, I did it, that's all."
Keith chuckled. "Exactly. You couldn't have described it better. We've always done what Susan wanted us to, and we never could tell why. We just did it. That's all. And oh, I'm so glad you did this, little girl. So glad."
"Yes, but—" She drew away from him a little, and her voice became severely accusing. "Keith Burton, you should have done it yourself, and you know it." He shook his head.
"I couldn't."
A swift shadow fell like a cloud over his countenance.
"Darling, even now, Dorothy, do you fully realize what you are doing? All your life to be tied—"
"Hush!" Her finger was on his lips, only to be kissed till she took it away. "I won't let you talk like that a minute. Not a single minute. But, Keith, there is something I want you to say." Her voice was half pleading, half whimsical. Her eyes, through her tears, were studying his face, turned partly away from her. "Confession is good for the soul."
"Well, anything more?" He smiled faintly.
"Yes, only this time it's you. You've got to do it."
"I?"
Yes, her voice rang with firm decision. Keith, I want to know why. Why all this time you've acted so that I had to find out through Susan that you cared. And I want to know when you stopped hating me and
Dorothy, I never, never hated you, cut in the man passionately.
But you acted as if you did. Why, you wouldn't let me come near you, and you were so angry with me.
Yes, I know. The man fell back in his chair and was silent. There was a long minute of waiting.
Keith,
Yes, dear.
I confessed mine, and yours can't be any harder than mine was. Still he hesitated. Then, with a long breath, he began to speak.
Dorothy, it's just that I've had so much to fight, and it hasn't been easy. But listen, dear. I think I've loved you from way back in the days when you wore your hair in two thick pigtails down your back. You know I was only 14 when the shadows began to come. One day, away back then, I saw you shudder once at blindness. We were talking about old Joel Harrington, and I never forgot it.
But it was only because I pitied him.
Yes, but I thought then that it was more aversion. You said you couldn't bear to look at them, and you see I feared even then that I was going to be like old Joe sometime.
Oh, Keith.
Well, it came. I was like old Joe, blind, and I knew that I was the object of curiosity and pity, and I believed aversion wherever I went. And oh, I so hated it. I didn't want to be stared at and pointed at and pitied. I didn't want to be different. And above all, I didn't want to know that you were turning away from me in aversion and disgust.
Oh, Keith, Keith, as if I ever could, faltered the girl.
I thought you could and would. I used to picture you all in the dark, as I used to see you with your bright eyes and pretty hair, and I could see the look on your face as you turned away shuddering. That's when I determined at all costs to keep out of your sight until I should be well again. I was going to be well, of course, then, you know. Well, in time I went west, and on my way I met Miss Stewart.
Yes?
Dorothy's voice was not quite steady. I liked Miss Stewart. She was wonderfully good to me. At the very first, she gave me quite a start. Her voice sounded so much like Dorothy Parkman's. But very soon I forgot that and just gave myself up to the enjoyment of her companionship. I wasn't afraid with her that her eyes were turned away in aversion and disgust. Some way I just knew that she wasn't like Dorothy Parkman. You see, I hadn't forgotten Dorothy. Some day I was going back to her, seeing. Well, you know what happened. The operations, the specialists, the years of waiting, the trip to London, then home, hopelessly blind. It was not easy then, Dorothy, but I tried to be a man. Most of all I felt for Dad. He had so many hopes. But never mind, and anyhow, what Susan said the other day helped. But this has nothing to do with you, dear. To go on, I gave you up then definitely. I know that all the while I'd been having you back in my mind, young as I was, that some day I was going to be big and strong and rich and have my eyes, and that then I was going to ask you to marry me. But when I got home, hopelessly blind, that ended it. I didn't believe you would have me anyway, but even if you would, I wasn't going to give you the chance of always having to turn away in aversion and disgust from the sight of your husband.
Oh, Keith, how could you?
I couldn't, but you see how I felt. Then one day I heard Miss Stewart's voice in the hall, and oh, how good it sounded to me. I think I must have caught her hand very much as the drowning man grasps at the straw. She would never turn away from me. With her I felt safe, happy, and at peace. I don't think I exactly understood my state of mind myself. I didn't think I was in love with her, yet with her I was happy, and I was never afraid. But I didn't have a chance long to question. Almost at once came the day when Mazie Sanborn ran up the steps and spoke to you, and I knew. My whole world seemed tumbling to destruction in one blinding crash. You can never know, dear, how utterly dismayed and angry and helpless I felt.
All that I knew was that for months and months I had let Dorothy Parkman read to me, play with me, and talk to me, and that I had been eager to take all the time she would give me, when all the while she had been doing it out of pity, of course, and I could see just how she must have been shuddering and turning away her eyes all the long, long weeks she had been with me at different times. But even more than that, if possible, was the chagrin and dismay with which I realized that all the while I had been cheated and deceived and made a fool of, because I was blind and I could not see. I had been tricked into putting myself in such a position.
"No, no, you didn't understand," protested the girl.
Of course I didn't understand, dear. Nobody who's blinded with rage and hurt pride can understand anything rightly.
"But you wouldn't let me explain afterwards."
No, I didn't want you to explain. I was too sore, too deeply hurt, well, I couldn't. That's all. Besides, I didn't want you to know how much I was caring about it all. So, a little later, when I did see you, I tried to toss it all off lightly, as if no consequence whatever."
"Well, you succeeded," commented Dorothy dryly.
"I had to, you see. I had found out then how much I really did care. I knew then that somehow you and Miss Stewart were hopelessly mixed up in my heart, and that I loved you, and that the world without you was going to be one big desert of loneliness and longing. You see, it had not been so hard to give you up in imagination, but when it came to the real thing—"
"But, Keith, why did you insist that you must?"
"Do you think I'd ask you or anybody to tie yourself to a hopeless creature who would probably finally end up on a street corner with a tin cup for pennies? Besides, in your case, I had not forgotten the shudders and the averted eyes. I still was so sure. Then John McGuire came home blind, and after a while I found I could help him. And, Dorothy, this is when I learned that perhaps you were as happy in doing things for me as I had been in doing them for John McGuire. I sort of forgot the shudders and the averted eyes then. Besides, along about that time we had got back to almost our old friendliness, the friendliness and companionship of Miss Stewart and me. Then the money came, and I knew that at least I never should have to ask you to subsist on what the tin cup of pennies could bring, and I had almost begun to actually plan, when all of a sudden you stopped coming right off short."
"But I went away," defended the girl a little faintly.
"Not at once. You were here in town a long time after that. I knew, because I used to hear about you. I was sure then that you had seen I was caring for you, so you stayed away. Besides, it came back to me again, my old fear of your pity and aversion, of your eyes turned away. You see, always, dear, that's been a sort of obsession with me, I guess. I hate to feel that any one is looking at me, watching me. To me it seems like spying on me, because I can't look back. Yes, I know it's all very foolish and very silly, but we are all foolish and silly over something. It's because of that feeling that I so hate to enter a room and know that some one is there who won't speak, who tries to cheat me into thinking I'm alone. I can't bear it, Dorothy, just because I can't see them."
I know," nodded the girl.
"Well, in December you went away. Oh, I knew when you went. I knew a lot of things that you didn't know I knew. But I was trying all those days to put you quite out of my mind, and I busied myself with John McGuire, told myself that I was satisfied with my work, that I had put you entirely out of my life. Then you came back in February, and I knew I hadn't. I knew I loved you more than ever. Just at first, the very first, I thought you had come back to me. Then I saw that it was Dad. After that I tried, oh, you don't know how hard I tried, to kill that wicked love in my heart. Why, darling, nothing would have hired me to let you see it then. Let Dad, knowing that his loving you hurt me. Fail Dad there, as I had failed him everywhere else. I guess not. This was something I could do. I could let him have you and never, never let him know. So I buried myself in work and tried to forget. Then today you came. At the first sound of your voice in there, when I realized what you were saying, to Dad, I supposed, I started up and would have gone.
Then I was afraid you would see me pass the window and that it would be worse if I went than if I stayed. Besides, right away I heard the words that made me so weak with joy and amazement that my knees bent under me and I had to sit down. And then but you know the rest, dear."
Yes, I know the rest. And I'll tell you sometime why I stopped coming last fall.
"All right, but even that doesn't matter to me now. For now, in spite of my blind eyes, the way looks all rosy ahead. Why, dear, it's like the dawn of a new day. And I used to so love the dawn. You don't know, but years ago with Dad I'd go camping in the woods, and sometimes we'd stay all night on the mountain. I loved that, for in the morning we'd watch the sun come up and flood the world with light, and it seemed so wonderful after the dark. And it's like that with me today, dear. It's my dawn, the dawn of a new day, and it's so wonderful after the dark."
Oh, Keith, I'm so glad. And listen, dear, it's not only dawn for you, but for all those blind boys down there that you're helping. You have opened their eyes to their dawn, of their new day. Don't you see?
Keith drew in his breath with a little catch. "Have I? Do you think I have? Oh, I should like to think that. I don't know, of course, about them, but I do know about myself. And I know it's the most wonderful dawn ever was for me. And I know that with your little hand in mine, I'll walk fearlessly straight on with my chin up. And now that I know Dad doesn't care and that he isn't going to be unhappy about my loving you and your loving me, I haven't even that to fear."
And oh, Keith, think what it would have been if I hadn't defied the properties, she faltered mistily.
Dear old Susan, bless her heart. And that isn't all I owe her. Something she said the other day had made me hope that maybe I hadn't even quite failed Dad. And I so wanted to make good for Dad.
And you've done it, Keith.
But maybe he doesn't think so.
But he does. He told me.
"He told you?"
"Yes, last night. He said that once he had great plans for you, great ambitions, but that he never dreamed he could be as proud of you as he is right now, what you had done for yourself and what you were doing for those boys down there."
"Dad said that?"
"Yes."
"And to think of my having that, and you, too," breathed the man, his arm tightening about her. The end. End of chapter 33. Recording by Sunny.
End of Dawn by Eleanor H. Porter.